What do you need to do when you make a bad shot? It's not real fun to think about, but it's best to be prepared. Hey everybody, Samuel Allred here. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. Today we're going to take on sort of a heavy subject, and that is what to do when you've made a bad shot. This isn't something that I really like talking about, and I'm going to tell you a story of making a bad shot, and it still stings and weighs on me. But if you find yourself in this position, it will be helpful to understand the next steps that you can take. If you hunt long enough, likely you will find yourself in this position at some point. And if you've never experienced it or you avoid this, good for you. I'm happy for you. But once again, you just want to think ahead and be ready for all the different scenarios that could happen. And knowing that you have a plan in case you make a bad shot and then following through with that will give you a way to process the whole experience. And if you do everything in your power to find that animal and you can't find it, then you'll know you did your best and you can move on from there. All right, before we get into our topic for today, as always, if you enjoy this podcast, if you've learned something new, please take a moment to follow the podcast and share an episode with a friend. This will help the podcast grow, and together, we will help more people get outside and into hunting, which is what Persistence Outdoors is all about. So thank you to everybody who follows the podcast or who has shared an episode with a friend. And let's get into our subject for today. I want to start out with a story of when I made a bad shot while deer hunting. I think that I did a pretty good job following this up. After I made the bad shot, the actions that I took afterwards were thorough, and I think they gave me a good chance of finding the animal, and I put in enough work to feel confident that I had done my due diligence. Now, I don't enjoy telling this story because it still hurts, but hopefully you can learn something from it. And after the story, I'll break it down into some easy steps to follow in case you find yourself in this situation. All right, so this happened a few years ago while I was still living in Tennessee. And I was hunting the archery season, and I was hunting with a crossbow. Some states say that you need to be disabled to hunt with a crossbow. In Tennessee, any type of crossbow or vertical bow was allowed. So I found a crossbow on Craigslist and started hunting with it. Now, the great thing about hunting the archery season was that it doubled the deer season for me. I had 6 weeks of archery and 6 weeks of rifle season. And so it was just a great time to be able to hunt for 3 months straight. And it gave me so many opportunities and helped me learn very quickly. This incident happened towards the end of the archery season. So I had already killed 2 does with my crossbow, and I was hoping to kill a buck. I could kill up to 2 bucks that season throughout archery and rifle season. And so I went out to this area where I had seen a buck a couple weeks before. I had some history with this area. I had killed a buck there in the past, and I had a good idea of where the animals traveled and where I could set up to possibly get a shot. Now, I had considered hunting this area on opening day of rifle season, but in the places where I hunted, there were so many other hunters that I really wanted to get another chance at this buck before the rifle season started. So I figured I would go out there, and even if I risked blowing the animal out, I would prefer to do that and maybe get a shot instead of letting someone else potentially hunt there on the first day of rifle season and ruin my chances. So I went back about a week before the rifle season started. I don't remember much leading up to the encounter, but I do know that it was an evening hunt and I was on the ground. So a lot of people, especially in Tennessee, will hunt with tree stands, but I just hunted on the ground. And it was a little bit in this river bottom. There was a field edge, maybe 60 yards away through some timber, maybe closer to 100 yards away through some timber. And it was kind of flat. It had just lots of nice deciduous trees around, lots of acorns. And I was sitting with my back to a tree, and I had made a little bit of a ground blind. There were lots of dead branches around, and I just piled those up to give myself a little bit of cover. So I was waiting there, and I was being quiet, and I was just waiting for a deer to walk through. One thing that you should know about my crossbow is that I had a fixed 4-power scope on it. And that was great for a lot of shooting. I shot a doe at 40 yards with that fixed 4-power scope. That was perfect. But I didn't have a lower range or a higher range. So I'm sitting there and I hear a deer approaching from my left. And it's breaking through some brush and rustling leaves. And I look over and I just barely see this deer, but it's coming in pretty quick and it just went behind a big stand of brush. And I can tell he's pretty close, surprisingly close. And he's coming in and I catch another glimpse of him and I can see he has antlers. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think he was an 8-point. His antlers were pretty tall and he would have been my best buck at the time. So he runs in and it turns out he's very, very close. I could see maybe 50 yards, maybe a little bit further, and I was only going to shoot out to 40 yards with my crossbow. But he came in between 15 and 20 yards, I'm guessing. And he was running past me. Not at full tilt, but just trotting through the woods the way deer do when they're kind of running and looking around. And he was not aware of my presence. So he's coming through pretty quickly and he's very, very close. And almost automatically, I bring my crossbow to my shoulder and I'm looking at him through my scope. And in the scope, he was close enough that all I could see was deer. I mean, he looked huge in the scope. And I instinctively aimed where I wanted to shoot him, but he was still moving. And without even really consciously making a decision to shoot, I pulled the trigger and let the bolt fly. That was my first mistake. The deer was still moving. And while I may have gotten away with that shot with a rifle, with the crossbow, the bolt is moving slow enough that since the deer was moving and since I didn't lead it at all, once I pulled the trigger, the deer was probably another 2 feet ahead of where I was aiming by the time the arrow hit him. And so I ended up, I believe, hitting him pretty far back. I don't know where exactly I hit him, but immediately after pulling the trigger, I could tell he was hit, and I saw blood on his hide. So once he's hit by the arrow, he slows down and is walking. And he still doesn't seem to even perceive that I'm there. He's just trying to figure out what just happened. And he's not quite hunched, but he's clearly hit. He's clearly bleeding and he's clearly hurting. And I do this thing where when I'm with someone and they take a shot, or when I'm watching a video, a hunting video, I start counting seconds, waiting for the animal to drop. And I was just doing this mentally, counting. And I get to 15 seconds and he's not running off the way that an animal that's been hit through the lungs or in the heart usually does. and I know something is wrong. So I'm watching him, and already I'm very nervous, and I try to start reloading the crossbow. And that's what I should have done right away. The animal was still there. He was within range. He's walking slowly, and chances are I could have taken another shot. So I try to reload the crossbow, but reloading the crossbow is pretty tricky, and I hadn't practiced reloading it quickly. And as I'm sort of getting the string pulled back with the cocking ropes and all that, the deer starts walking off further from me. And I'm afraid I'm going to lose him in the brush. And I'm also still counting, and it's over a minute by now, and he's not falling down. And I'm just hoping he will fall down or wobble a little bit, and he's just not. He's just walking slowly. So I get distracted because he's walking away and going towards some brush. And I think I need to keep an eye on him so I can see where he goes. And so I stop reloading the crossbow. And that was my second major mistake. I should have just focused in and reloaded that crossbow. So he finally walks away from me and hangs up in a little patch of brush where I can just see him barely. And it's starting to get dark, and I range him, and he's maybe 60 yards away. Well, my max shot with a crossbow for hunting purposes, I had limited myself to 40 yards, and I had the bow, sighted in at 40 yards. But at 60 yards, I could have aimed a little high and likely still hit him. But I was so caught up with watching him and hoping he would fall and nervous that I didn't think to reload my crossbow. And so he hangs up in this brush and eventually starts walking away up the hill and into thicker brush, and I lose sight of him. So, like I said, I think I hit him pretty far back. And if you know where to shoot a deer, usually you're aiming for right around the crease of the shoulder, the front shoulder, or a little bit behind it. And to this day, I can't tell you exactly where I hit that deer. My guess is either the liver or possibly sort of the front part of his back leg. And I know that's kind of far apart on a deer, but he was moving quickly. And I just didn't get a good look at where I hit him after I shot him. I was kind of focused on other things, but I did see blood on him, and he reacted in a way that I knew he was hit. I believe I also heard the sound of the arrow hitting, which is kind of like a wet thump. Now, I also said that he didn't react in a way that made me think I hit his lungs. Deer, often when you get a lung shot, will run away in a sprint. It's sort of a panic or a fight or flight response, and then they will pile up within 20 to 60 yards. Same thing with heart shot deer. They just run away instinctively. Now, when you hit a deer through the guts a little bit further back, chances are the deer will hunch up and they might walk away or they might run away slowly, but it's not that same sprinting reaction. Sometimes when you hit a deer through the heart, they'll also do a mule kick, and that's a pretty good indication that you made a good hit. They'll kick both of their back legs in the air before clearing out of there. And then if you hit a deer in the spine, there's a good chance that it will fall, but still be alive, and you'll have to put another arrow in it. So you can look at a deer and see how it reacts to get a clue as to where you actually hit it. And generally, you just want to see it take off at high speed after making what felt like a good shot. Once the deer left the area, it was getting darker, so I decided to go out and look at the area where I had hit the deer. And I went out, paced it off. Again, I think it was only around 20 yards, and I found the area where the deer was standing. And there was clearly blood. I mean, red blood. There weren't bubbles in it, so it didn't seem like a lung shot, but there was lots of bright red blood. And so it indicated something like a muscle hit, maybe a liver hit. And so I was glad that there was a lot of blood because it meant that maybe the deer would die or maybe I would have something to follow it by. But I was also just so nervous because I had seen it walk away and I hadn't heard it fall. So the blood was a good sign, but I knew that if you make a bad shot on a deer, you should back out or at least not go after it right away and let it die. So I backed out, and around this time, I texted a buddy and told him what happened, and he said, "Stay right there, I'm coming out." So he came out to help me track this deer. He brought a super bright flashlight, and he is a much more experienced deer hunter than I am. And so he knew a lot more about blood trailing deer than I did at the time. So he comes out and we go back into the area about 3 hours later. And we get to the spot where I shot the deer, and he looks at the blood and I look at the blood, and I'm all nervous. I'm worried sick, but he looks at the blood and he's like, "Oh, sweet, there's blood. It's bright red. Like, I think you hit him good." And I'm just thinking back and I'm thinking, no, I don't think I hit him good, but right, here's the blood. We can trail him. So he's like, "This looks like good blood. I think we should just go after him." And I agreed. I thought it was enough time. And so we start blood trailing this deer. Now, this is about the time that I realized that my dinky little headlamps that I had were not bright enough to successfully blood trail deer at night. I had hunted deer at night and found them in the dark, but their trails were much shorter, or I had to do a little bit of gridding to find them. But this deer had gone a long ways, and my headlamp just wasn't cutting it. So my friend had a very bright flashlight, and that saved the day. Without that, I don't know that I would have been able to trail that deer in the dark at all. So now I'm a big proponent of very bright headlamps or flashlights. So we start trailing this deer, and he's teaching me all sorts of things. We do this process where basically we find blood, and then one of us stays where the blood is while the other person goes ahead in a bit of a semicircle, looking with a flashlight to find more blood. And this is pretty successful because you always know where the last blood was. You can kind of have an idea of the direction that the deer's going when you find new blood, and you keep just going on. It was painstakingly slow in some places. Other places, it was pretty easy to follow. At one point, there was no blood for maybe 20 feet, and we just had to sort of grid ahead where we thought the deer went. And thankfully, with his help, we were able to track the deer for about 200 yards. I called him the Bloodhound. He was amazing, and I really appreciated his help in that moment when I was just sort of freaking out, to be honest. It takes us a long time, and at this point, it's pitch black, and we are approaching a private land boundary. The deer obviously had a place in mind, because as we approach this fence and we see that the blood trail leads to this fence, in the dark, we hear an animal get up and start crashing away. And so we had bumped the deer. And this is one of the things that you really try not to do when you're tracking an animal. If it beds down, there's a good chance that the longer it's bedded down and the more blood that it loses, it could stiffen up and eventually die. But if you get close to the animal and you scare it, it can get a big boost of adrenaline and get up and run further away. And so this is what happened at like 11:30 at night, and we couldn't see the animal at all, but it obviously winded us or heard us, and it got up and ran away. So at this point, we just bumped the deer that I shot, and it's on private land. And so in the middle of the night, we can't really do anything about it. So that was discouraging, especially after finding such a long blood trail. We were thinking, oh, we're just going to find it dead anywhere along this trail. We didn't, and then we bumped the animal, and there was nothing we could do. So we backed out, and went back to our car. And that evening, I went home. And I didn't sleep very well that night. All I could think about was getting back out there. But first, I had to get permission from the landowner to continue the search. So this is tricky to do because, first of all, you have to find the person. And if they don't have a house on the land, there's a chance that they own the land but live somewhere else. Thankfully, the person who owned this land was somewhat local, and I was able to look up his name and tax address using OnX Hunt. So I found his information, and then my wife actually found him on Facebook. And the next morning, or even that evening, I think, we messaged him and said, "Hey, this happened. Here's my phone number. Please give me a call," so that I could get permission. And then the next day, he hadn't responded, but I actually found his work information. And so I called his work. And this guy is like a doctor. And I just leave a voicemail at his work at like 8 a.m. in the morning saying, "Hey, this happened, not work related. Please give me a call back." So thankfully, he does give me a call back, and he was super gracious about it. He gave me permission to track the deer. He asked me how big it was, and he said, "Yeah, no problem. Go do what you need to do and just send me a picture when you find it." And so it was so kind of him, and really his reaction was a lot more positive than I anticipated. I thought, calling for access to his private land right before rifle season starts, this isn't going to go over so well. But he was completely nice about it, and I got access. So I drove out to that piece of property as soon as I could, came in from a different direction. My friend joined me again, and we picked up the trail on the other side of the fence. And sure enough, there was the blood trail going right through. So we tracked the deer another 50 or 60 yards until we found where it bedded down in the middle of a field, sort of near someone's house, actually. And we could see where it had bedded down and just bled all over the place. And that was the crazy thing. It was still bleeding, and bleeding profusely, even when it had bedded down in this field. And from there, we started to try and figure out where it had gone. And the blood trail was so confusing at that point. It looked like it went in a circle. Then we found blood 50 to 60 yards apart in a triangle, and we really couldn't pinpoint where it went next. So we kept looking around, kept combing the area, and at this point, it was just a mess. There was no clear exit that the deer had taken, and we really didn't know where it had went. Well, finally, we find one tiny pinhead-sized speck of blood on a leaf on a trail leading to the next property over. And to this day, I'm not sure if that was from our deer or maybe it was just another deer crossing over and it nicked itself on the barbed wire. But it was the best lead I had. None of the other blood trails panned out. And so I decided to try and get permission to go onto this adjacent property. And so the landowner who was letting us track on his land let me know the other landowners' names. I called them. They were actually coming out to hunt that property for the muzzleloader season that had just started. And so they said, "Hey, thanks for calling. Please just wait until we get there." And so I said, "Fair enough." And I waited until one of those guys arrived. And so they didn't want me to go stomp around in their good whitetail spots, but they were willing to help me track the deer. Unfortunately, though, after that one pinhead-sized drop of blood, the trail went completely cold. I don't think we found a drop of blood on the other side of the fence. And when they looked at my final clue, they were like, "Oh, this isn't going to be good." So we went over, we walked side by side, we gridded the area just a little bit, But at that point, we had nothing to go on, and we weren't even confident that the deer had crossed through that way. So at that point, I had followed the blood trail hundreds of yards and found where the deer had clearly been hanging out the evening before. And we had checked every inch of this property where the blood trail ended, and we just found nothing. And so at that point, my buddy was telling me stories of the time he lost a deer. And one of the guys who guided me onto the adjacent property, he was telling me, it happens. If you hunt long enough, you're going to lose a deer. Good job, trailing him this far and looking for him, but it just happens sometimes. And there were really no other clues to go on. So the last thing that I spent a little time doing was just sitting out there and waiting to see if there were some vultures. Sometimes vultures or coyotes can find an animal and lead you to a kill. It may take a little bit of time though. And I saw a vulture circling around and I got excited for a bit, but then he kind of just meandered off and it was inconclusive. So after about 12 hours of searching for the animal, after tracking it hundreds of yards, after gridding the last place we saw it, after getting permission to go on 2 different pieces of private land, after driving, an hour both ways from where I was living to this area, I decided to give up the search. That was a disappointing experience, and it felt bad in many ways. One, I felt bad for injuring the deer and making it suffer. And then also I felt bad that I had missed the opportunity to harvest that deer and bring home all the meat. I don't really think that animals that die in the wild go to waste, but they could be used for a better purpose. And for me, that better purpose is for feeding me and my family. And so it was disappointing in both of those ways. That deer also would have been the biggest buck that I had killed, and that would have been cool. And so multiple avenues of disappointment all wrapped into one experience. Now, there are some silver linings. I learned how to blood trail a deer much better than I could before. And I learned how to read evidence and try to go off that instead of my faulty memory. I also learned that I probably needed to wait longer than I did. And it would have been better to wait and let that deer die, even though I had waited 3 hours, 6 hours, or coming back the next morning might have been a better option. So let's run through the steps of what you need to do if you make a bad shot so you can be prepared and learn from my mistakes. So first of all, be careful about shooting moving animals. That was clearly not a shot I should have taken with a crossbow. And that's what led to all of the rest of that scenario. Secondly, if you've made a bad shot, you need to mark the area where you hit the animal. You need to do this regardless, so be very intentional about thinking where the animal was hit and then where you last saw the animal. And mark both of those places if you can, because you are going to need those points of reference to start tracking the animal. The next step is to look for evidence. You are going to have a memory of what happened, but often memory fails or it can be corrupted. And the way you perceive the situation is different than how it actually is. And so you need to look for evidence. One of the best things when you're bow hunting is to find your arrow. I couldn't find my arrow in this scenario because I was on the ground and it went through the animal and it didn't stick into the ground the way that shooting an arrow from a tree stand would cause it to. But if you can find your arrow, likely you can find some blood on the arrow. If it has, bubbly pink blood, that's lung blood. If it has dark red blood, that could be liver blood. If it's bright red blood, that could be heart blood. And then if you've got something like feces or stomach matter on that, it means you hit it further back. So finding the arrow is a good place to start gathering evidence. You also want to look around and find the blood. You want to think about how the animal reacted and how it exited the scene. And all of those pieces of evidence together can help you determine how you need to proceed. It's also a good idea to get some help from a friend. When you go through this experience, you might be emotional or sick to your stomach, or you might be rushing a little bit, and having someone else who isn't caught up in all that is going to help a lot. They're going to be able to be more objective. They may be able to read the evidence better because they're not competing with your specific memory of the situation. And then they're also going to be able to help you track. And 2 people tracking is better than 1. Now, if you suspect that you've hit the deer far back, it's worth it to wait 4 hours or even more. A deer that's hit through the stomach will die, but it's going to take a while. And so it's important to give it some time. And like I said, let it bed down, stiffen up, lose some blood, and hopefully it will die right there instead of going further on. A deer that's been hit in the liver, 4 to 6 hours should do the trick. A deer that's been hit in the stomach, longer than that is a good idea. You might want to just back out and come back the next morning. If you're worried about losing meat, think of it this way. 1, if it's cold enough outside, the deer is likely to stay, edible for a while. It's not going to be as good as a freshly killed and field dressed deer that you hit through the lungs. But if it's cold enough, chances are you're still going to be able to salvage meat. The other thing is, if you hit it through the guts, it's not going to start spoiling until it dies. And it could take 4 to 8 hours for the animal to die. So if you clearly hit it through the guts, it's best to back out. You don't want to do anything to disturb it, and then come back maybe in the morning, maybe later that day, and start tracking then. When you do start tracking, and really anytime you're approaching a dead or wounded animal, it's a good idea to reload and be ready to take another shot. And it's a good idea to use your binoculars and try to find that animal at a distance instead of just walking up on it. Because if it is still alive, you could bump it. But if you can see it from a distance, you might be able to shoot it again and end the whole ordeal. So once you've waited the appropriate amount of time, go ahead, start tracking. This can be hard to do. Sometimes you'll have a great blood trail, other times you won't. If you know you've hit the animal, like you find blood at the original site, and then the blood trail runs out, at that point you can start gridding. And gridding is just like mowing a lawn. You're trying to cover every inch of that area. And likely if you were following a blood trail and it runs out, you might start gridding just to find that blood trail again. So you don't want to think about necessarily looking for a whole entire animal. You might want to be looking for blood as you're gridding that area. And you might find that blood trail again and be able to keep tracking the animal. Now, alternatively, if you're gridding well enough, or if you have enough people out there searching, you will stumble upon the animal and you will have recovered the dead animal. And I've done this before. It helps to keep track of where you've been with your tracker in the onX Hunt app, or some other way, maybe just keep waypoints or think about landmarks so that you don't continually go over the same places or miss places. But gridding is a legitimate way of finding an animal once the trail has gone cold. In my story, I stopped after gridding and exhausting every possible blood trail, going on to the next private property. You could, at this point, or even earlier on in this process, you could find someone who has a tracking dog. And there's sometimes Facebook groups for these people. Sometimes you can just Google it and there will be a phone number. Maybe it's a friend, but people have dogs and they might be hunting dogs or they might be specifically tracking dogs. And sometimes for free, sometimes for a fee, they will bring their dog out and help you search for an animal. And so if you have access to that, that is not a bad idea, and it could certainly help you find a lost deer. Another option, if it's legal, is asking someone with a drone. Someone with a drone may be able to help you locate your deer. You just need to make sure that drone recovery is legal in the area that you hunt. Now, you may not have access to a tracking dog or someone with a drone, and so there's also nature's tracking dogs and drones, which are coyotes and vultures. If you come back a day later, you may hear coyotes gathering around your kill, or you may see vultures circling, and those are worth checking out. There's plenty of people who have found their kill by listening for coyotes or watching for vultures. Now, at this point, you may not salvage as much of your animal, but at least it brings some closure and you know where it is and what happened. It's hard to know when to give up the search. And really, I'd say it's a personal thing. It depends how much time you have. It depends, what the evidence and what the trail is like. If you know you've hit it, though, you will feel better if you do your due diligence to find that animal. So do your future self a favor and don't leave any doubt in your mind that you could have found that animal, but you just didn't try hard enough. Do what you've got to do and make a good effort. If you're confident that you've killed or mortally wounded an animal and you're unable to retrieve it, it's common practice to symbolically notch your tag. So if you've taken your amount of the allotted resource, it's common practice to end your hunt there. Now, I told a story last week about shooting at an elk and missing it. And I believe I grazed it, but after reading the evidence and having someone else come out and take a look at all the evidence that was there, looking for blood, tracking the animal as far as we could go, we concluded that that animal was alive and well and that I had just clipped some hair off of it and I probably didn't make it bleed at all. And so in that situation, I believe the animal's alive and well, and so I felt confident to continue hunting. But if I had hit that animal and it was wounded and it had got away, I would have called that the end of my hunt because I knew that I had potentially killed my elk for the season. So you'll have to use your best judgment and, once again, rely on the evidence as much as you can. All right, guys. Well, with that, I will wrap this up. But if you do, I hope you're more prepared to deal with it after listening to this episode. Also, realize that you still have an opportunity to recover the animal even if you've made a bad shot. So follow these steps, do your best to be patient and diligent, and you may find your animal, and at that point, it will become a great hunt again. So I hope this helps you feel more confident hunting this season. Have a great week, everybody, and I will catch you on the next one.